We're going to look at an, a different way to look at technologies altogether. There are a number of technologies at any given time. I'm sure we've all been hearing about 3D printing, blockchain, artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. And a question that comes up throughout all of this is which of these technologies is just going to be another incremental improvement in how we do things after it has gone through the hype phase. We all know about the hype curve, right? Most technology, when they first come on the scene, there's all sort of excitement, and the entrepreneurs and visionaries jump in. There are anecdotal successes that begin to build up incredible amount of hype around the technology. However, most technologies, once they've gone past the hype phase, really almost die out as an overreact, almost as a correction to the overhype that happened before, and they come back and really settle into an incremental improvement kind of technology. Every now and then, however, a technology can come and take us all by surprise. It can fundamentally revolutionize how something is done, really change the way something is approached at a very fundamental level. So the question that comes out of all this and is extremely important for a professional such as yourself, or for an investor, or for anyone really in general who is curious to see if a technology is going to grow up to be just another incremental add-on to the world of technology, making things better incrementally, or is it going to really fundamentally, thoroughly revolutionize how we do something? I'm sure we can all think of examples of each of those two types. There is a wonderful book in the library, in Santa Clara University Library, called The Victorian Internet, that where someone has actually gone in and documented, done a really good job of it, written by a journalist, on how a new technology called sending messages from point A to point B electrically, using electricity, grew up to be the telegraph technology. And some would argue that that's the internet would not have been possible without that being a technology that paved the way for it. So the technologies, before they become revolutionary, go through all sorts of interesting phases. There are times when it looks like they're actually going to change the world, and then they seem to fade into the background. Some even get heavily criticized and get pulled away, modified in very significant ways. They can even generate a lot of skepticism, a lot of doubters, naysayers, and yet some of them seem to come back after all that, after all sorts of detours along the way, and actually change the way everything is done. So we look at, so how do we know? I mean, how do we think about that question that would put us in a better position to be able to predict whether a given technology is going to be one of those incremental technologies, or is it going to be truly a game changer? To answer that question, or to help with that question, or at least to help us with how to think about responding to that question, we're going to look at the work of a philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was a professor at UC Berkeley, came from Harvard, was given a subject to teach, something to do with history of science. And as he was doing his research in the history of science, he had an epiphany that what we that what we call, we generally think of progress in science as as an ability to get closer to the truth, the reality, being able to explain the reality. Uh, so one would normally think that Aristotle's notion of physics was made obsolete by the Newtonian explanation of physics. Or one would say that Newton's physics was closer to capturing how things actually work in reality, much more so than Aristotle's were. Thomas Kuhn was looking at all of that, and he suddenly realized that that's really not the case. Aristotle's physics simply represented a different worldview than Newton's, but one cannot claim to be any closer to truth than the other. They just represent different worldviews. So he coined a word, a word that's used all the time these days, but in all sorts of ways, probably more so than it should be. And that word was paradigm. He came up with an interesting thesis on how much of what happens in science, and perhaps also in technology, happens within the bounds of a given paradigm. Paradigm being a whole set of practices and principles and philosophies and ways of looking at things that collectively make up this field within which we do all of our explorations, and within which we generate the kinds of questions we ask or choose to ask, and even to the point where actually when you're in a paradigm, it actually determines what you're able to see and not see. So in a way, the paradigm determines perception. There's a great story in one of his older books called The Copernican Revolution. The same set of planetary objects were in the sky before and after Copernicus. But pre-Copernicus, using the same telescopes and same equipment and so on, the astronomers were not able to see some of these astral objects, whereas after Copernican revolution, they were right there, as clear as anything. And all that had changed was the paradigm through which they were looking at the world. So it's a powerful idea that that really is quite provocative to much of the scientific community. Most of us in the world of science and technology consider ourselves to be fairly objective. We believe that when we see something, our observations can be objectively verified by a fellow scientist or fellow technologist. They can be tested repeatedly through experiments. What Kuhn said rubbed many of us in the scientific community in the wrong way. Essentially, he was saying that really we don't see what's truly there. What we see is profoundly colored and shaped and chosen by the paradigm we happen to be living in. So even those of us who consider ourselves truly rational and objective scientists are in fact not really are dependent subjectively on the paradigm that informs us in the first place. So what does all that have to do with being able to tell which way technology is headed towards being an incremental technology or a revolutionary technology? So let's look at that. So one of the most persistent issues when we examine a new technology that's just come on the scene is that we are looking at a new technology through the eyes of the old paradigm. For example, most of us in this room in engineering, we have read textbooks and grown up in our field, mastering design principles and so on, that are relevant to the manufacturing paradigm that has emerged since the last industrial revolution. So whether consciously or unconsciously, implicitly or explicitly, as we go about designing an object, a tool, or anything for the real world, we are applying principles like standardization, consistency, specialization of use. There are a set of fundamental principles that have been ingrained in our minds, which we may not be, they come to us so naturally from having grown up in this paradigm that we don't even really question them or think about it, or sometimes not even aware of them. If you look at something like 3D printing, through that paradigm, it would appear to be a really slow, cumbersome technology with very limited choices in the materials that can be used, so on and so forth. However, Kuhn would say that unless we're able to step out of the paradigm and look at something new from a different paradigm, it is a fundamentally flawed comparison. He articulated that in the form of a principle called principle of incommensurability. What that essentially means is that comparing two paradigms, or how something would appear when looked at through two different paradigms, cannot be compared. Any comparison between what's seen from one paradigm versus the other is fundamentally absurd. And yet, all of us, I'm sure, we look at blockchain or 3D printing or artificial intelligence, and we find it really almost impossible to step out of the paradigm that we've all grown up in as professionals and look at it in a whole different way. So how do we step out of a paradigm, and what does all this have to do with being able to predict which technology is may or may not turn out to be revolutionary? Well, paradigms are really difficult to kill by any intention or a deliberate strategy of some sort. The paradigms have incredible hold on us at levels, at even unconscious or subconscious levels, making it almost impossible to step outside of them. However, paradigms do every so often self-destruct. How does that happen? Let's take the paradigm we've been looking at, the mass production paradigm, for example. Every paradigm has problems inherently in it that is not able to quite address to the satisfaction of people who practice it. There are unresolved issues within any particular paradigm. In mass production, for example, we could say that there are some fundamental issues that we have not been able to reconcile in a satisfactory way. Let's take for example an issue that was raised to awareness by artists, the artist community, when the Industrial Revolution first happened. People like Charlie Chaplin, for example, who made interesting movies like Modern Times and so on, where they really tried to bring to people's attention that this way of thinking about making things, called mass production, is going to require fitting a human being to a repetitive task, something human beings are not naturally designed to do, creating depletion and all sorts of social issues and uprisings down the road. Those of us who chose that paradigm of mass production, the Henry Ford's assembly line and so on, we knew that problem existed, but we decided that anomaly was there, but was real, but we chose to ignore it, and we felt, well, maybe someday we'll figure out a way to address that problem. But overall, this is the right way to design things and build things. Now, if for some social, political, economic reason, some shift happening somewhere else, maybe not in the world of technology itself, were to make it almost unbearable to go on producing things in our mass production paradigm. Let's say, for example, the climate change issue, or when we run out of being able to take manufacturing work to third world countries. Uh, One way we've dealt with this anomaly of forcing people to do something that they really probably don't enjoy doing because they're human beings, and human beings weren't really designed to do the same thing repetitively, mindlessly, over and again. So one way we've sort of been kicking that can down the road and not having to face up to that anomaly is by shipping our manufacturing overseas to poor countries where people really don't have the option of choosing what they want to do, what vocation, whatever pays the bills, right? So, however, at some point it's possible that we will run out of places to ship manufacturing to, and there may be a revolt of some sort, and people may refuse to do that kind of work, and that would be an example of an anomaly flaring up from something happening in our external environment, bringing the entire paradigm to sort of a state of disruption. The entire paradigm begins to crumble down, and a whole new way of designing and building things needs to be conceived of. At that point, something like 3D printing or the paradigm associated with 3D printing, designing and building things one at a time in a very customized way, and thinking of design in terms of about how things are designed in nature by a emerging field called biomimicry. All of that may form a different kind of paradigm, and if that paradigm is able to attract enough people to support it, or as the Kuhn would call it, the adherents, if enough people choose to embrace that paradigm and support it, 3D printing may transform into a truly revolutionary technology, fundamentally changing how we design things, how we think about designing things, and how we build things, and therefore where they get built, who builds them, and all sorts of social and political and economic ramifications that will flow out of that. So, in summary, Thomas Kuhn's ideas can be used to see if we were to see any trends or events out there that are threatening the very existence of the current paradigm of how we design and build things. That would be a good way to tell that 3D printing may in fact be a revolutionary technology, and if not, it may just turn out to be another tool in the bag of engineers and of manufacturers and so on. So that's it for now.